Hi, this week in class our focus is on how to bring in different instructional materials into your content area teaching. And while your textbook includes a lot of good information, I do want to spend some time talking to you about how to use nonfiction, children's and young adult literature in your content area classroom. So as a result of viewing this video, you should be able to do the following things. You should be able to identify different reasons for using nonfiction in your classroom. You should be able to differentiate between some different genres or types of nonfiction. You should also be able to locate and evaluate nonfiction titles and identify some ways that you can use nonfiction in your content area classroom. So using nonfiction is important because it has a lot of positive benefits for students. For one, if you include children's literature or young adult literature about nonfiction topics in your classroom, it can expand your students' background knowledge. And as you learned the other week when we talked about schema theory, the more background knowledge that students have, the better, because background knowledge can enhance their reading comprehension when they go to read about other topics that are related. So nonfiction can also support content area standards. It can also support literacy and standards in English language arts. Nonfiction can also build students' vocabularies, and I'm not just talking about sort of a general vocabulary, but I'm also talking about content-specific vocabulary, so students can be exposed to different terms that you might expect to hear in a content area classroom. As we know, the different content areas like math, science, and social studies have a really specialized vocabulary, and reading nonfiction with students can give them multiple exposures to these specialized words that students need to know to understand the content. So nonfiction can also expose students to different types of text structures, and text structures refers to the different ways that authors choose to organize the information in a text, and more on that in a few minutes. And it can also give readers exposure to different sorts of text features, which I'll also talk about shortly. And finally, nonfiction books like children's literature and young adult literature can also be motivating for students because they tend to be more interesting and engaging compared to, say, using the textbook that's assigned for your course. So as we learned the other week, motivation is really important. So these are just some of the many reasons for using nonfiction, children's, and young adult literature in your content area class. So I want to differentiate between some terms that I'll be using throughout this presentation. One term that you should be aware of is the term informational text or informational book. And sometimes you see this term referred to as expository text. It really means the same thing. An informational text or an expository text is simply a book that conveys information. One example would be The Universe by Seymour Simon, who is a really well-known author of children's nonfiction. And the universe, as the title implies, simply describes the universe, and as well as things like different galaxies and so forth. And we also have literary nonfiction, and this is sometimes called narrative nonfiction. And a work of literary nonfiction is a book that conveys information. It's truthful, but it's told in a format that resembles a story. It's more of a narrative than an informational book. And one of the differences would be that an informational text like The Universe by Seymour Simon, you can really pick up a book like that and read about any topic that you want within the book. And you don't have to read the entire book. You might just want to know like one thing about your topic, and you can get that information from reading in a particular place in the book. But with literary nonfiction, you really just can't pick up the book in the middle and understand what's going on. Really, literary nonfiction is meant to be read from cover to cover because it's really more like a story than an informational text. And a really good example of literary nonfiction is the book Bomb by Steve Schenken. As you can see from the book cover shown on the slide, that book has won many different awards, and it's the story of how American scientists made the discoveries that enabled them to create the atomic bomb, and it is also about how other countries such as Russia tried to steal the information about the atomic bomb that the Americans had discovered. So it's a great example of literary nonfiction, and it's also a really great read. I think that if you have some time this summer to read. I know you're probably laughing like, haha, she must be joking. But if you do have time, that might be one to pick up and read, even if you're not, really that interested in history. I think that it's very engaging and very dramatic, and it's one that I think that you'll enjoy. Highly recommended by me. So there are different types of informational texts, books that are about topics such as science or mathematics, geography, art, music, physical education, health. Those are examples of informational texts. Also how-to books, cookbooks, encyclopedias, which tend not to be used very commonly anymore, as well as news articles are all examples of informational texts. So generally with informational texts, the books make very general and specific statements about the topic, and they're usually written in the present tense. However, when you are reading an informational text about a historical event, it may be written in the past tense, which makes sense given the content of history. It makes sense to write it in the past tense, but oftentimes it's written in the present tense, especially if you're reading a book about a science topic or about, say, math or something like that. But history, oftentimes we find written in the past tense. And informational texts are usually organized according to different text structures. And again, a text structure is just a way that authors choose to organize the information that they're presenting. So these are some of the common types. We have sequence, which is also known as chronological. And with that text structure, authors tend to tell a sequence of events from the beginning to the end. And as you might expect, you tend to see a lot of history books written according to a sequential or a chronological text structure. But if you also are reading books about, say, processes in science, like how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, a book like that is also likely to be written according to the sequential text structure. In the compare and contrast text structure, the author compares and contrasts two different objects or two different events or two different people. Whereas in problem solution, the author writes about a problem and then describes the solution to that particular problem. And then we also have the descriptive text structure, where the author is simply describing an object or an event or a person. And sometimes you might come across an informational text that only uses one type of text structure, but I think it's fairly common for many authors of informational books to utilize several different kinds of text structures. As an example, the book Neighborhood Sharks by Catherine Roy uses both the sequential text structure as well as the descriptive text structure. At the beginning of the book, she uses the sequential text structure when she talks about the steps that white sharks take in order to capture their prey, which is elephant seals. And then throughout the book, she includes the descriptive text structure when she talks about how sharks have different body parts that enable them to be able to effectively capture their prey. For example, sharks have high definition vision to enable them to see their prey, and sharks also have bodies that enable to move them quickly through the water so that they are able to get to their prey once they see their prey. So the author uses both sequential and descriptive in that particular book. So informational texts include some of these features, and many of these are likely already familiar to you. One would be a table of contents, and a table of contents lets you see the different topics that the book covers. The index is a listing of the different topics, events, and people that are mentioned in the book. So if you want to locate information quickly, you are able to do so by using the index. As an example, I have a children's book about the different oceans in the world, and if I wanted to just look up information about the Atlantic Ocean, I could flip back to the index and see what pages the Atlantic Ocean is mentioned on, and I could then turn to those pages and read about the Atlantic Ocean. And that would also enable me to get to the information I want and skip over the information that is not interesting to me. As I mentioned before, with a nonfiction book, especially an informational book, you don't necessarily have to read an informational book from cover to cover. Sometimes you just want a little bit of information and you don't want to read the rest of the book, and that's okay. And that's where the index really comes in handy, as well as the table of contents. A glossary in an informational book is sort of like a dictionary of key terms that are mentioned in the book. Informational books also include headings and subheadings to organize the different topics. And those headings and subheadings also serve as important cues to the reader to let the reader know what it is that they're going to be reading about. And as I mentioned in last week's lecture, when we talked about comprehension strategies, having students preview those headings and subheadings is a really important step to helping them comprehend a reading selection. Oftentimes, informational books also emphasize key vocabulary within the body of the text. So, for example, we might see important vocabulary words in a bold font or an italicized font. And it's important to note that sometimes authors of informational books will actually define unfamiliar terms within the body of the text. So you don't actually have to flip back to the glossary to figure out what an unfamiliar word means. Oftentimes the author will just come out and tell you because the author understands that the reader may not understand the meaning of a highly technical or specialized vocabulary word. Also, with a good informational text, you have things like captions and labels, especially in relation to visuals that appear in the text. For example, earlier I shared with you a little information about Seymour Simon, who's a really well-known author of children's nonfiction. And Seymour Simon's books include really beautiful photographs, but the problem with them is that they are not captioned. So when you are looking at them, you don't really know exactly what it is you're looking at. And when you're reading about a topic like the universe or the solar system, you really want to have those pictures labeled or captioned so you understand what it is you're looking at in the photograph. So a good nonfiction book is going to include captions and labels. And you also sometimes find with informational books sidebars that include additional information, information that is ancillary to the main topic that is being discussed in the text. And I have an example here from the book Carcapo Rescue, Saving the World's Strangest Parrot. As you can see in the picture, I know it's probably small on your screen, we have the main body of the text on the left side of the page spread, but on the right side we have a page called Carcapo Fast Facts, which just has information about Carcapo parrots that doesn't quite fit the main body of the text, but it's still interesting for readers to know. So the authors include that information using a sidebar. And then informational text should also include visuals like photographs, illustrations, as well as things like maps, timelines, and diagrams, so that way readers' understanding of the content being presented is enhanced. As an example, on this slide I have a picture of a map from Carcapo Rescue. Carcapo Rescue is about saving a highly endangered species of parrots that live off the coast of New Zealand, and the map in this picture or on this slide helps you see exactly where New Zealand is in the world in relation to Australia. It also helps you see where the islands where the Carcapo parrots live are off the coast of New Zealand. So it helps contextualize the location of the book. And I forgot to mention it on this slide, but another thing you want to look for with a good informational text is a bibliography. And the point of a bibliography is to point you to additional sources that you might want to consult. And a good bibliography should also list the different sources that the author of the book consulted. And I'm going to talk more about why that's important a little bit later on in this recording. So now we move on to literary nonfiction, which again reads more like a story or like a narrative compared to informational books. Genres include biography, which is a story of a person's life told by another person. A really great example of a biography is the book Lincoln, a Photobiography by Russell Friedman. It's a description of Lincoln's life from his childhood to his death in 1865, and it includes many great photographs of Lincoln's life, so it really gives a nice picture of what his life was like, and it's really a top-notch example of a biography. Then we also have an autobiography, which is similar, except an autobiography is the story of a person's life told by that person. An example is Knots in My Yo-Yo String, an autobiography of a kid by Jerry Spinelli. He's a really famous children's book author, and I actually like to use that book in my undergraduate language arts class when I teach students about writing workshop, because that book really has a lot of good examples of quality writing, and I like to share it with students so that they can try to adopt some of Jerry Spinelli's writing techniques in their own writing, and so they can teach their future students how to do the same. A memoir is similar to an autobiography, but it really only tells a slice of a person's life. It doesn't tell about someone's life from beginning to near the end. It just tells about a particular moment in time or a particular year in someone's life. A great example is Through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges. And Through My Eyes tells about how Ruby Bridges was one of the first African American students to integrate the New Orleans public schools. And the book is all about that year in her life when she was in first grade, and she was the only child in her first grade classroom because none of the white parents would send their children to school with her. So it's a good example of a memoir. And I also consider literary nonfiction to be books that center on specific events or people that tell a story, that don't just describe an event, or they don't just describe people and animals, but they also make a story out of it. And one example that was published fairly recently is 8 Dolphins of Katrina, A True Tale of Survival, which is a book that has some local flavor. It actually is about some dolphins in Gulfport that were housed in an oceanarium. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, they were washed out to sea. And the book tells about how they were rescued. And it's really like a story because it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And it's very dramatic. It's a really good example of literary nonfiction, and that might be one to check out if you're interested in a book that has some local flavor to it. So literary nonfiction is somewhat different than informational books in a few ways. For one, literary nonfiction is often told using that sequential or chronological text structure. Not always, but often. Again, it's very much like a story. It will read more like a novel than an informational book. And it may not have some of the features that you typically find in an informational book. For example, it's fairly unusual in my experience for a work of literary nonfiction like a biography to include a glossary. Sometimes they might include headings and subheadings, but not always. Sidebars tend to also be fairly uncommon. And sometimes, you do see things like maps, timelines, and diagrams, but you don't always find that in a work of literary nonfiction. So you might be wondering how you can locate quality nonfiction. One of your first sources should be the school librarian, and if your school librarian, maybe your school library doesn't have a great selection of nonfiction because of, lack of resources or whatever reason, you could also consult with the youth services librarian at a public library. So either of those two individuals should be very happy to help you. Oftentimes librarians will allow you to borrow a large number of books for an extended period of time if you explain that you're a teacher and you are doing a unit of study on a particular topic. The librarian will be very happy to pull together a set of books for you and will probably be very happy to let you borrow those books for as long as you need them. But you can also try to locate quality nonfiction on your own, and I tend to tell teachers that a great way to locate quality books is to turn to different book awards, because when a book has won an award or an honor, it's already been vetted by a group of highly qualified individuals, so it takes the guesswork out of determining whether or not a book is of high quality. So what I have listed on the slide are just some different book awards that include nonfiction for both children and young adults. For example, the Seibert Medal is given by the Association of Library Service to Children, and the winners and honorees of the Seibert Award tend to be for children ages 14 and under, but I found that a number of them are actually quite appropriate for young adults, for middle and high school students, not just for really little kids like elementary students. So keep that in mind. Don't discount it just because it's an award for children. We also have the YALSA Award for Excellence in Nonfiction for Young Adults. And YALSA is, let me try to remember, the Young Adult Library Service Association. I got it. Which is a division of the American Library Association, and every year they award or they recognize different books for, for their outstanding nature. Also, the National Council of Teachers of English has the Orbis Pictus Award, and books that win the Orbis Pictus tend to be about a variety of different topics. They're not just books that are relevant to English language arts. All sorts of books, like books about science topics and social studies topics, have won the Orbis Pictus Award. The National Council of Social Studies has the notable social studies trade books for young people, and they include a list on their website of books that include social studies content. However, what I don't like about their list of books is the fact that you can only access the most recent book list if you're a member of NCSS. However, you can find some book lists that are several years old by visiting their website, but say if you wanted like the 2015 book list, you have to be an NCSS member to access that, unfortunately. And then finally, the National Science Teachers Association publishes an annual list of outstanding science trade books. And luckily, that book list is available to the public. You don't have to be an NSTA member. And I believe that all of these book awards are given out annually, so you might want to bookmark these websites and check back every so often to see what books have been recognized with an award or some sort of an honor. So just some sources you might want to check out. Now I want to move into talking about how to evaluate nonfiction books for young people. And I really like this framework, which was created by Barbara Moss and her colleagues, and it's called the 5 A's. And I want to talk about the 5 A's in the context of the book The Family Romanov by Candace Fleming, because I consider that a wonderful example of children's and young adult nonfiction at its best. So I want to talk about these particular criteria within the context of this book. So the first criterion is the authority of the author. Now, when we select nonfiction books for children and young adults, we want to look for books that are either by, 1, experts in the field, or 2, by authors that have done a great deal of research on the topic. And you can find out whether or not the author has done research on the topic because usually in a good nonfiction book, the author will include a bibliography of sources that he or she has consulted in writing the book. And he or she might also include extensive notes, like footnotes, that describe like where particular quotes used in the books came from and so on. And also the author's authority can often be established through an acknowledgments page, like the author might acknowledge, different people such as librarians who help the author in locating information. So you want to look in the back of the book to see if the author has a robust bibliography. And The Family Romanov is a really great example of this criterion because the author, Candace Fleming, did extensive research, and that's really evident in her bibliography. I don't remember offhand how long the bibliography is, but it is several pages long. It shows that she consulted a number of different sources, including primary sources. One interesting thing that I learned from reading her book, and especially looking through her bibliography, is the fact that the Russian imperial family, the Romanovs, did most of their correspondence with each other and with their and with others in Russian society in English. So the author was able to access those letters and the other correspondence from the Romanov family and read those primary source documents without a translator because the author speaks and writes in English. So we really see that Candace Fleming has a lot of authority as an author of this book because she just did so much research, so much reading of primary source documents. She also traveled to Russia and took a tour of many of the places described in the book. So she really, even though she didn't start off as an expert in Russian history, really became one through her writing of this book. So we also want to look for accuracy of the text content. And as a content teacher, we can often evaluate that because we should be knowledgeable about our subject area. But you also want to look to see who the author acknowledges in the book. For example, Candace Fleming acknowledges a professor of Russian history. In this particular book, she actually had a professor who is a subject matter expert read her manuscript and make sure that it was in fact correct. We also want to make sure that the books we select are appropriate for the children and young adults that we teach. And I think the family Romanov is certainly appropriate because the author includes a lot of background information about world history that young readers might not be familiar with. So she just doesn't start launching into the story of the Russian family without giving a context for young readers. She really situates their story within the context of world history and talks about, the international significance of their lives and ultimately their downfall. Also, the writing demonstrates a great amount of artistry. It is not boring, it is not dry, in fact, it's quite good. To demonstrate that, so you're not just taking my word for it, I wanted to read to you a couple of paragraphs from the book. And the paragraphs that I'm going to read to you describe a costume ball that Tsar Nicholas and his wife, the Empress Alexandra, held. His wealth, meaning Tsar Nicholas, was on full display that evening. Dressed as Alexei the Mild, the gentle 17th century Tsar, whom Nicholas nostalgically admired for having ruled, he believed, during a time of piety and morality, he wore a raspberry velvet caftan embroidered with gold thread, its collars and cuffs flashing with diamonds. He even carried the real Alexei's iron staff and wore his sable-trimmed cap and pearl bracelets. Too bad, sniffed one Grand Duke, Nicholas was not sufficiently tall to do justice to his magnificent garb. But it was the appearance of Empress Alexandra that caused many in the hall to gasp. Alexandra was wearing a gold brocade gown shimmering with the thousands of diamonds and pearls that had been sewn onto it, a costume that cost 1,000,000 rubles, $10 million today. Her elaborate headdress glittered with diamonds and emeralds, and her pearl earrings were so heavy it was hard for her to hold up her head. Around her neck hung an enormous 400-carat blue sapphire. She was just stunning, one guest admitted, but others disagreed. She was dressed in the heavy brocade of which she was so fond, one catty countess recalled, with diamonds scattered all over her in defiance of good taste and common sense. So I really like that particular passage because it just describes so well how Nicholas and Alexandra were dressed. It really gives you a good image in your mind. And I also like how the author includes quotes from people who were actually there to get another perspective. And then finally, our last criterion within the 5 A's is the appearance of the book. We want a book that is visually appealing or attractive to children, or else they will not want to actually read the book. And I feel like the family Romanov is very eye-catching because, as you can see on the cover, we have a picture of the imperial family looking very, very imposing. And if you look in the middle of the book, you have several sections of photographs that, depict the people and places that are described in the book. So it's, there's a lot to see and a lot to enjoy about this book. And this criterion isn't part of the 5 A's, but I do review children's books for a magazine called School Library Connection. It used to be known as Library Media Connection. And I review a lot of nonfiction for this magazine. And something I look for when I evaluate nonfiction is that the author includes multiple perspectives, or the author includes the voices of groups of people that have been traditionally silenced or marginalized, especially in textbooks. For example, in the family Romanov, the story really focuses on the Russian imperial family. However, Candace Fleming also includes the perspectives of the Russian peasants who were living at that time. So we really get their side of the story, and we can kind of see how the imperial family was viewed through the eyes of the common man. Another book that does a really good job of this that I actually reviewed very recently is The Industrial Revolution for Kids, The People and Technology That Changed the World. And certainly this book includes a lot of information about the Industrial Revolution from the point of view of people like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller. However, it also includes stories of children and women who are forced to work in dangerous factory conditions. And what I really liked about this book is that it doesn't just gloss over the Industrial Revolution as the story of progress. It also tells sort of the gritty side of the story that we don't often hear about when we read history textbooks. So when you look at biographies and when you evaluate biographies, there are some special considerations that you should have. You really don't want a biography of someone to depict the person as somehow being some perfect or superhuman individual who just has this endless string of accomplishments to his or her credit. And you also want to avoid biographies that are just organized according to a person's birth and a person's death. because that tends to get dry and boring. It's a lot more interesting when a biography is organized according to different themes of a person's life. But when you find a good biography, you're going to see some of the criteria that I have listed on the slide here. For example, instead of depicting a biography subject as somehow perfect and larger than life, you're going to get a more balanced portrayal of that subject, and you're going to learn about certainly the person's contributions to the world, but also some of the challenges and obstacles that the person faced. And one really good example that and I also recommend to you is The Voice That Challenged a Nation, Marian Anderson and the Struggle for Equal Rights by Russell Friedman, who is also the author that wrote the biography about Abraham Lincoln I mentioned earlier. What I like about that book is it talked about Marian Anderson's contributions to the world in terms of her status as an entertainer and as an artist, but it also talks about many of the challenges that she faced. If you're not familiar with Marian Anderson, she was African American and faced a lot of racism. For example, she wanted to perform at Constitution Hall, which was owned by and may still be owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, but they would not permit her to perform there because she was African American. And actually, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady at the time, was so angry about that she resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution in support of Marian Anderson. So, a really great example of a biography because it tells a side of history that isn't so savory, but it tells the truth about what Marian Anderson's life was like. So what I have shown on the slide here, these are some questions that you want to ask yourself when you are evaluating both informational books as well as literary nonfiction for the students in your teaching. So you really want to make sure that the author of the text that you're examining has done a great deal of research. You also want to make sure that the book is logically organized. And one thing you also want to keep in mind is, is the book going to be engaging and interesting to your students? You want to make sure that it's just not this dry, boring list of facts, but it's actually something exciting, something that students actually want to read. And luckily, in the past 10, 15, 20 years, nonfiction has gotten really good. And there are lots of excellent works of nonfiction for children and young adults out there, and certainly more so than I had available when I was a young person. These are just some things that you should be wary of when you select nonfiction for your classroom. You should be very skeptical of books that don't include bibliographies or that have very limited bibliographies. If you find that in a book, that's a cue that the author, or a clue that the author has not really done his or her research about the topic. And you also want to be wary of bibliographies that rely on questionable sources. Like if a bibliography has Wikipedia listed as a source, you should feel pretty skeptical about that book because, as you know, Wikipedia can be useful for some purposes. It's not a good source to depend upon for writing a book because anyone can edit Wikipedia and include information that's not accurate. And you should also be wary when the book includes very little information about the author's research process or about the author's qualifications to write the book. And you also want to be mindful of the copyright date in nonfiction books because, as you know, our interpretations of history change and our discoveries about the natural world are also changing constantly. So nonfiction, unfortunately, can become quite outdated over time. As an example, I have this book in my personal collection called The Planets by Gail Gibbons. And Gail Gibbons is a well-respected writer of children's books, but I would not include this book in my classroom if I was still teaching elementary school because it's simply outdated. The copyright date of the book is 1993, and 1993, Pluto was a planet, but in 2006, scientists classified Pluto as something other than a planet. So the information in the book is no longer accurate because, our understanding of science has changed. So when you select a nonfiction book, it would be really wise to look at the copyright date and make sure that the book is still current. And also use your judgment as a content teacher. You should know the subject matter fairly well. So there are certainly lots of ways that you can use nonfiction in your content area class. I would strongly advise you to include read-alouds in your class when you can. My argument is that everyone enjoys being read to, whether they admit it or not. I mean, it's certainly something that I enjoy, and I'm well into adulthood. And it's also something that your adolescent students may enjoy as well. It can be relaxing, and it's also a great way for them to learn new information, be exposed to good vocabulary, and also be exposed to a fluent and proficient reader. Nonfiction can also be used to introduce new content and also to supplement information that might be given a cursory treatment in your course textbook. And one good entryway into introducing new content is actually through pairing fiction and nonfiction. For example, if you were teaching a U.S. history class, you might have your students study the fledgling United States and some of the challenges that were faced by the United States after it won the American Revolution. There are a couple of children's and young adult books that you could use for teaching that topic. For example, Laurie Halse Anderson has written this book, Fever 1793, which is about a teenage girl whose family is impacted by the yellow fever epidemic that strikes Philadelphia in 1793, and the book also talks about the impact of the fever on Philadelphia as a whole, not just on her family. So because that book is a novel, I would argue that it's a lot easier to read than, say, a textbook. And it's also a good way of introducing students and getting them interested in the topic of Philadelphia in the 1790s. And it actually might be a good introduction to having students read a book like Jim Murphy's An American Plague, the true and terrifying story of the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. That book is also about the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, much like Fever 1793 is, but this tells it, from multiple points of view about the different people that were involved in, dealing with the yellow fever epidemic, including government leaders as well as everyday people. And that book also includes a lot of information about, the science behind yellow fever. So pairing An American Plague with Fever 1793 is a way of making the content of early American life a lot more accessible because, the fiction choice might be easier for students to read, and it might give them the background knowledge they need to really understand the book An American Plague, which is more difficult to read. And certainly nonfiction can be used to help students write reports or create presentations. And I also want to talk to you about a strategy called Textmasters. And Textmasters is similar to a literature circle or a book club discussion. And literature circles and book club discussions are simply small groups of readers who are reading the same book, and they come together to talk about it. And Textmasters is similar, except instead of reading novels and other works of fiction, students are discussing their textbook, or they're discussing a text that you might read in a content area. For example, they might read and discuss a book like An American Plague, or they might read and discuss a book like Carcapa Rescue. And students within a Textmaster group take on different roles. They do their reading assignment and they do their role sheet for homework, and then they bring it to class the next day ready to discuss and ready to share. And the roles include the discussion director, and the discussion director's job is to write questions that are about the text for the group to talk about. The summarizer identifies the key information in the reading assignment and writes a summary. The webmaster is a student who takes important information and organizes it into some kind of graphic organizer like a concept map or a web. And finally, the vocabulary enricher is a student who identifies vocabulary words that are potentially unfamiliar, and that student will define the word or words and use them in context and maybe even draw an illustration to accompany the different words or the different terms. So students rotate their roles. So if you're discussion director one day, you might be summarizer the next day. And I've actually used the Textmaster strategy in college courses I've taught at both the graduate and undergraduate level. And students tend to enjoy it because it's a social opportunity. And students have also told me that it enhances their comprehension, especially when the reading assignment is difficult, because they get to hear someone else's perspective about it, and therefore they learn more about it. And Textmasters, isn't something that necessarily has to take up your whole class period. I know that many of you teach in blocks and may only have your students for an hour at a time, maybe even less than that. You can certainly have students do the Textmaster strategy for maybe, say, 15 or 20 minutes of the class period. It doesn't have to be, the whole class. And another thing to consider is that you can use book discussions like Textmasters outside of the school setting. Now, if you work in a district where students have ready access to computers and the internet, you could use a website like Edmodo to allow your students to have discussions about books that you have them read related to your content area teaching. I like to describe Edmodo as sort of a cross between Blackboard and Facebook, and it's a free website that is specifically designed for K-12 educators, and it has a number of functionalities, but one of the functions is that you can break students into small groups and you could have them talk to each other. So if you don't have time to integrate a strategy like Textmasters in your class, you could have students do it for homework, and you could have the students talk about the books outside of the school setting, which I think would be appealing to many adolescents because they enjoy using computers and going online anyway. So this is a chance for them to do so and to interact with their peers. And one of your assignments this semester is to create a poster illustrating a text set. And a text set is simply a set of books, articles, videos, and other resources that are organized around a central topic or a theme. And with a text set, you can have students choose which text or texts that they want to read about that topic or that theme. And what's useful about a text set is that it gives students choice. So they can choose from the different items included on your text set, and they can learn the information in the means that they wish. So it's something to consider in your content teaching. But again, you learn more about how to do that as you work on that assignment. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the sources that I consulted in creating this presentation, and I'm really enthusiastic about the topic of nonfiction, in case you couldn't tell from my presentation. So if you have any questions about using nonfiction in your content area classroom, or about some nonfiction books that you might want to check out on your own, please don't hesitate to ask me. I'm very happy to talk about books. It's like my favorite subject in the world. So thank you for viewing.